Did you put on share the screen?
Already.
All right. All right. I don't know how many of you got the devotions this morning, but today we were talking about being on guard. Uh, we talked about how the numbers for the virus they go up and they go down. Right now, it seems like things are on a downward stroke. But one of the things that the experts keep telling us is to not let down our guard, regardless of where it's at. And so that was the title of the devotion this morning. Don't let down your guard. And we talked about how that the devil is like a roaring lion, seeking who he may devour, and that God wants us to always be on the alert, so that we don't lose our testimony. Well, I didn't plan it this way, but the devotion flows right into what we're going to be looking at in James chapter 1. And what we're looking at today in James chapter 1 is understanding the anatomy of temptation. The anatomy of temptation. And would to God, and I try to make things as simple. I try to try to understand what the word is saying, and then break it down so that everyone can understand it. And I would hope that that you would share this message or the notes with young people, because they're the ones that's going to uh, face a lot of temptation. We, uh, and I say we because most of us are around the same age bracket, uh, that we don't face as much temptation. Now, we still face temptation. So I want to make that clear. We still face temptation, but maybe not as much as the young people today. I often tell my wife that, I wouldn't want to be a young person today with all they got to deal with. I mean, there's just so much that they have to deal with in this culture and this society. And that's why we need to pray, for our young people, because temptation is all around them. If you look at some of the videos and the music and where they're at, and as far as the clubs and all that kind of stuff, man, there's temptation that's just beating at their door all the time. So I really think that the lesson that we're dealing with is very helpful, because in the end, and we're going to look at this toward the end of the lesson today, that James says that the end of it all, that the end of it all is death. Is so there's nothing good that can come out of temptation, especially when a person yields to it. So the outline that we're looking at today is number one is the bait of temptation. Number two is the birth of temptation. Number three is the bereavement caused by temptation. And then number four, and we'll look at this next week, we're not going to get to this today, and that is the battle against temptation, the battle against temptation. So, temptation is something that we all face, to some degree. So when we look at the source of temptation, uh, we see, or the bait, we start out by looking at the bait of temptation. Let's read James chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But let every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So verses 13 and 14, we're looking at the bait of temptation. So the first thing that I want to say is that James makes it very clear that God is not the source of temptation. So anytime that you are being tempted, God is not the source of that temptation. That temptation is always from the wicked one or the flesh, and that temptation is always trying to get us to do something wrong. God, and we've seen this far in the book of James. God allows trials to come into our lives, and He allows trials to come, uh, and He gives us the wisdom to deal with the trials, and that these trials come from God. To as we look at Job, who said, "The Lord knows the way that I take, and He knows that when I'm tried, that I'm going to be brought forth as pure gold." So God allows trials to come into our lives to strengthen us, to build us up, to show us what's inside of us. Temptations do not come from God. They come from the evil one, and they come to destroy us. Now, God can let uh, Satan, as we know in the book of Job, he can let Satan have access to our life to tempt us, but God is not the source of the temptation. So God is in control of everything. So we have to say that God is even in control of the temptation in our life, even though He doesn't bring the temptation. And so God can let down, as I said, the gates. He can let down the wall, the guard, so that temptation can come into our life. But again, keep in mind that James makes it very clear that God is not the source of temptation. Now, when we look at the bait of temptation, there's an outward bait and there's an inward bait. So we need to be aware of these because as we are aware of them, then we will know better how to deal with temptation. There's the inward uh, source of temptation. And notice what James says. James says that it begins when everyone is drawn away by their own lusts. Drawn away by their own lusts. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about this, so I'm just kind of highlighting it right now. So that is the inward, that there's something in you that connects with the temptation that draws you away from it. So that that temptation might be, if you're trying to eat right, it might be some bad food. Now, again, that's not to say that we can't go off of our plan every now and then, but when we have determined that we're going to do a certain thing, and especially when we determine that we're going to do something godly or live right, and then we end up falling away from that. Why is that? That's because of the lust, the desires in our heart. So like I said, I'm gonna say more about that in a second. And then the external source, notice that he says in verse 13, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust. And notice the next word, enticed. He is enticed. So there's the inward, which is your lust, your desire. And then there is the outward, the thing which entices you. So let's look at the bait of the temptation. So notice, and again, I put these Greek words in here because they are just so rich. I find that James, I mean, he just, and we've seen this already. He uses so many word pictures, and they become so clear when we understand some of these words that he uses. And so James talks about this whole idea of the lust, being drawn away of the lust, and notice what the Greek word for drawn away, it refers to a baited trap used to lure an unsuspecting animal away from its security. And that is how it all starts. that there's something that is there that draws us away. But notice that where does it start? The trap is baited with lust. Now, if you'll notice that trap that I have on the screen, I got that's actually a bear trap. Something that would be used to catch a bear or some big animal. But notice what I have in there is a cupcake, right? And why? Because for many a cupcake can be very alluring, very very tempting, and so this trap is baited with a cupcake. But when we look at traps that are set for people, they are baited with uh, lust, adultery, uh, fornication, lying, uh, bitterness, envy, jealousy. It's baited with those things. And because of the lust that's within us, we gravitate to the things that are in the trap. All right. So I like what he says here. He is drawn away. Just to think that, I heard about the cobra in the Middle East, and how that the cobra sometimes will fix his eye on a bird, and the bird will make eye contact with the cobra, and it's like the cobra with its motion kind of puts the bird almost in a trance, where the bird is wandering closer to the cobra, and the cobra is wandering closer to the bird, and the bird is unsuspecting that the bird is leaving its place of security. And when the bird gets close enough, the cobra pounces on it, opens its mouth and swallows the bird. So what happens there? That the bird is drawn away, is drawn to the cobra, and then when the cobra gets close enough, it pulls the lever on the trap, so to speak. And so we need to realize that there are things that bait temptation for us. And you know what? Some of them only what baits the temptation. I find that sometimes, even on my computer, and I'll go to check my mail, and then all of a sudden, there's ads popping up, on the side, ads for, maybe some shoes, or maybe ads for a suit, or maybe ads that are of another nature. And so, if you're not careful, you can find yourself like James is talking about here, being allured, to the baited trap. So we see the bait of temptation. Uh, Rick Warren says this: temptation always starts in your mind, not in your circumstances. All right. Because there's a lot of people that can see the same thing. And two different people can look at the same thing, and one person is not affected by it, and then the other person is drawn or lured to it. Well, what makes the difference? It's your heart. If your heart is filled with lust, if you haven't taken control, and let me clarify now, when I say lust, I'm just not talking about like sexual lust. I mean, it can be lust for, again, for power. It can be lust for fame, can be lust for some material thing. So so two different people can look at the same thing, and one person can turn around and walk away from it. It don't bother them. And then the other person, finds themselves being drawn into it. Well, what makes a difference? Well, it's your heart. What's in your heart. And so going back to, what we said here is that the trap is baited with lust. Again, it may be alluring to some, and to others it may not bother them at all. So Rick Warren says that when you deal with temptation, that it always starts in your mind and not in your circumstances. Now notice that James also says in verse 14, he says this. He says, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust, and notice this, and enticed, and enticed. The word enticed comes from a Greek word that means to bait, to catch a fish with bait, or to hunt with snares. And so the idea of this word enticed, it was a fishing term that was used for bait that actually was an allure to the fish. So, again, I'm just amazed at these word pictures that James uses to to present these concepts to us. As as the old saying goes, James make it so easy that even a caveman can understand it, right? The bait. So there's the bait. There's the bait of the trap, and then there's the bait of the fish being allured. And that's how they would catch catch a fish to allure them with bait. So any of you that have ever been fishing, it's like I heard the story about the guy, older guy who was retired, and he just was lazy. He didn't want to do anything. And so he went fishing one day, and he put his line in the water, but he didn't have a hook or bait or anything on it. And somebody asked him, well, you're not going to catch any fish like that. Why? Are you just throwing a line in the water? And the guy said, I'm tired. I'm retired. I'm taking it easy. I don't want to work at all. I don't even want to catch any fish. I don't even want to get any bites. I don't even want any fish to nibble on my line. So I don't have a hook, or I don't have any bait on there at all. Because he didn't want to do anything, right? But we realize that James uses this term because he wants to let us know that there's a bait with a hook on it that's out there that's trying to entice us. So that's the word entice. When you look at this word entice, that's what it means. It means to bait or to put bait to catch a fish. All right. Now we see that temptation is insatiable. That once you start to act on it, right? Once you begin to be lured to the trap, once you begin to follow the hook and the bait, right? Then there comes this insatiable, and this is where a lot of guys and girls get in trouble, because it just overwhelms them. That this sense of desire towards the temptation just overwhelms them. And notice what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 1:8. The eye is not satisfied by seeing, or the ear filled with hearing. So this lets us know that when if we have a lustful heart, right, and we see something and it attracts us, like the allurement to the trap or to the hook on the fishing line, it allures us, right, and we begin to pursue it. Solomon said that the eye is not satisfied with seeing, because the more you see, the more you're going to want. That's the way lust is when temptation comes away. The ear is not filled with hearing. That means that when you hear something, like if somebody hears a juicy piece of gossip, they want to hear more, right? They want to hear all they can, because there's this insatiable desire that never gets fulfilled. Now here's a illustration of something, and I've shared this illustration before, but there's a technique that Eskimos use if they have a wolf that is a danger to them. And what they do is that they get a knife and they put blood on the knife. And then they put the knife below the surface of the snow. And so when the wolf comes in and begins to sniff, the wolf smells the blood. And then the wolf begins to lick the snow where the knife is. And eventually the wolf will become consumed with licking the knife, and his tongue will, split open. And he's so consumed. I'm trying to help somebody now. I'm trying to help somebody now. That the wolf becomes so consumed with licking the blood on the knife, and then he begins to lick his own blood, and eventually he ends up, killing himself because of the loss of blood, all because of his insatiable desire for blood, and he ends up, taking his own life. And you know what, my brothers and sisters, this is a perfect example of temptation and lust. What happens is that you end up, and again, I got some things I want to talk about at the end, but one of the things that happens, when we are consumed by our lust, that death takes place. Now, this death is not just a physical death, but sometimes it's a death to relationships. Sometimes it's a death to a spiritual life with God. Sometimes it's death to the things around us. And so we look at uh, uh, what happens, and what is the end result. The end result is death. So just like this wolf, consumed with the temptation, consumed by the lust, ends up taking his own life. Uh, John Dryden, I like what he says. Better to shun the bait than to struggle in the snare. Right? Better to shun the bait than to struggle in the snare. In Proverbs chapter 7, it talks about the simple man who went by the house of the harlot, and he ends up going in her house, and they end up having a relationship. And at the end of chapter 7 of Proverbs, it says that he is like a animal that's caught in the trap, waiting for somebody to put an arrow through his heart. Wow, that's that's a pretty bad predicament. And so, this guy right here says that, it's better to shun the bait, that when we see the bait, that we need to deal with our heart. And we're going to talk about that next week when we talk about dealing with temptation. But we need to deal with our heart so that we don't find ourselves caught in the trap, and then now we're caught in the trap, and we're like the man in Proverbs 7. We're just waiting for somebody to come and, put an arrow through us to finish us off. All right. So, this is, where temptation leads. Now, notice this. So again, I've been talking about James, and I've been talking about how he shifts metaphors, right? So now James shifts metaphors, and he goes from the metaphors of hunting and fishing about temptation, and now he uses the metaphor of childbirth about sin. So again, this, to me, this is just masterful, the way that James does this, and he does it all throughout the book of James. I guess maybe that's why one of the reasons why I mean, there's a lot of books in the Bible that I like, but the book of James is one that I love, and I love it because of the style that he writes, and how that he gives these word pictures, and he paints these, uses these different metaphors about things that we would deal with. So in verse 15, James shifts from the metaphors of hunting and fishing about temptation to the metaphor of childbirth about sin. Notice what he says. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. So we move into this idea now of the birth of temptation. that, we've looked at the allurement of temptation and how it draws people in, but now we look at the birth. And so we see here that James begins by describing lust as conceiving an offspring, right? So it says lust when it has conceived, that lust conceives, just like a lady conceives a child. If you notice that picture on the screen there, this is a picture of the fertilization of the sperm and the egg. And I watched a video about a year ago where and I don't know how they did this, but they've proven that when the sperm and the egg come together in the womb, that and they documented this, and they had a picture of it, that there's a flash of light. I said, wow, that's that's deep, right? That when this happens, there's a flash of light, and that means that conception has take place. And so James, he begins by describing lust as conceiving an offspring. And when this happens, there's a flash of light in the soul, so to speak, that takes place. And that flash of light is a child, and that child is sin. Notice that he says, when lust have conceived. That word conceived actually means a woman taking a man's seed in conception. So again, saying I'm just James, he just blows me away at some of these word choices and some of these metaphors. And so lust here is described as a woman conceiving a child, and that child is sin. Now, Psalm 7 and verse 14 kind of gives a little description of this. It says, behold, the wicked travaileth with iniquity, and have conceived mischief, and brought forth falsehood. So the writer of Psalms says that the wicked person conceives mischief and also brings forth falsehood. And so we see that reiterated in the Old Testament. Now, as we look at the birth of temptation, so when a person yields their will to lust, James said it brings forth sin. It brings forth is from a Greek word that means like a mother giving birth to a baby. Lust gives birth to many kinds of babies. So lust, when it has conceived, it can have triplets, quadruplets, right? It can have, give birth to 10, and so we see that, lust gives birth to adultery, hatred, jealousy, envy, strife, and the list goes on and on and on. And so this is actually the birth of lust, that when it conceives, it brings forth sin. All right. And now notice this, that James says what happens with the sin is that it causes bereavement, right? That means it causes death. That when a person sins, that death has taken place. Now, again, I'm not necessarily just talking about a physical death, but there's a death that takes place. And we see this in Adam, that when Adam sinned, what happened? Death entered into the world. And so now we see the end result is a physical death, but there was spiritual death, there was relationship death, there was all those kind of deaths that took place when Adam sinned. And so when we sin, especially when we give into lust and temptation, there's a death that takes place. And notice here that sin is birthed. Right? So let me go back. The lady is giving birth, right? Temptation and lust is giving birth. And what pops out is sin pops out. Now, notice this, that James says when sin is finished, when it's finished. Again, here goes James again, using those words, those Greek words. You know what the word is finished means? It actually means when sin is fully matured, fully grown, or complete. So there's a process now that when lust and temptation give birth to sin, that now sin begins to grow. And that when sin reaches its full development, that's when death takes place. So the way I look at it is that when we give in to our lustful desires, spurred on by the outward enticement, that in the womb of our souls, that there is a birth that takes place. And that birth is sin. And then whenever sin is delivered, it begins to grow, right? So, sin is delivered. And as it grows, that means that you are in the process of acting out that sin or acting upon that sin. And so as that sin begins to grow, and then you begin to do what happens as a result of that, and you complete that cycle, then sin what? Sin has been fully matured. Sin has grown to the fullest extent. And then at that point, what is caused is death. So it's just like a baby that's maturing, right? Coming to a place of maturity. That when sin comes to the place of maturity, that means you act upon it, then the result of that is death. Sin always brings death. It always brings death. Romans 6:21 through 23 and Romans 8:6 talks about the fact that sin brings forth death. Notice that it brings relationship death. Just think of the devastation that takes place when somebody in a marriage has been unfaithful, and how it just kills that relationship. Some people can, bounce back from it and go on with their relationship, but it's almost like a part of that marriage has died. A part of that relationship has died. And so sin always brings death. Sin brings spiritual death. That whenever we sin, that's why we have to repent. That's why we have to ask God for forgiveness, because there's been a spiritual death that has taken place between us and God. And so we go to God. Again, when we ask God for forgiveness, it's not so that we can be saved, because we're already saved. But when we sin and we ask God for forgiveness, we're asking for forgiveness to have our relationship with God restored. Why? Because sin has brought death to that relationship. And we know that there's a physical death that takes place. That because Adam sinned, we all are going to die unless the rapture takes place, or unless we're Elijah or Enoch. Everybody has sinned and will have to deal with physical death. And that's the result of sin, this physical death. And then there is eternal death, which is being eternally separated from God. And when we are eternally separated from God, that's probably, to me, the worst death that a person can face. So James gives us the anatomy of sin. And next week we're going to look at how do we battle against sin? How do we deal with sin? And then if you look at the scripture there, a word of warning from the book of Proverbs: can a man or woman take fire into their bosom and their clothes not be burned? And the answer to that is no. You can't. If you mess with fire, you're going to get burned. Now I'm going to show this, and hopefully no one gets offended by me showing this. If you're offended, you write me and I'll apologize. But I thought that this was a way to bring it down home for some people. Maybe not for everybody, but for some people. Notice here, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So we see the word picture there, right? Brother is getting his rap on, all right? But what's the problem? The problem is evidently she is another man's wife or girlfriend, whatever the case you might want to be. And what's getting ready to happen to this brother? He's getting ready to get taken out. And so, it says there, then when lust hath conceived, it brings forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. So again, the death that takes place, is in this situation, is probably going to be a physical death. But death to a relationship, death to spiritual life with God, death, as we saw, eternal death. So just think about the next time that you are tempted and you want to give in to sin. Just think about the end result and what can happen in that situation. And that should be a motivation to all of us, going back. And I would say going back and dealing with it, right here. All right. That you gotta keep your heart pure, and you gotta keep your heart clean, right? So that when there's outward appeals of lust, that it's not affecting your heart. Because then if your heart begins to be lustful, then you're going to act upon those, or most likely you're going to act upon, whatever those enticements are. So next week, we're going to deal with how to battle temptation. We're going to look at, how do you overcome temptation? Because what James is writing is real. And keep in mind that James is not writing to the lost folk. James is not writing to heathenistic sinners. James is not writing to ungodly people. Notice what he says here. James, in chapter 1, verse 1, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greetings. And look at the first phrase that he comes off with: my brethren, or my sister. He's talking to both. And so, again, if you look at, statistics, and this, this kind of scares me, because it says that half of the men, if on any given Sunday morning in the congregation, that half of the men have dealt with pornography within the last week. And not only that, but a quarter of the women have dealt with it. And so, we see that, the saints, they kind of are dealing with this thing on the same level that the sinners are dealing with it. So, again, we don't want to, I should have put a picture of that animal that's caught in a trap, that's waiting for somebody to come and shoot an arrow through his heart, right? Because that's where temptation lands us. It lands us in a place where the next step, if as we give in, is death. And again, that just don't necessarily mean physical death, but the end result of temptation is not good. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if anybody has a comment or question.
Right? Anybody?